Welcome to everyone joining our LEC seminar series online through YouTube. It's a pleasure to have you with us. May I now introduce Frances Cleaver, our new Chair of Political Ecology, who will introduce our speaker for today.
Hello everybody. I'm Frances Cleaver, and I started as Chair of Political Ecology at Lancaster last Friday, so brand new, and obviously together with political ecology colleagues looking at social, political and economic dimensions of people-environment interactions. I've got a particular interest in institutions for the governance of natural resources, and in line with that interest, Jamila Haider's coming to Lancaster as a visiting researcher to explore the intersections between her interests in resilience and development and mine in institutions and governance. So I'd like to introduce Jamila Haider. She's a researcher at the Stockholm Resilience Centre at Stockholm University, and she has a postdoctoral project which involves her visiting Lancaster Environment Centre. So we're very delighted to welcome her here to talk about her work focusing on resilience and development. And just to note that both Jamila and I are completely brand new to Teams and the software, so please bear with us if it's a little bit clunky. But now I'm delighted to hand over to Jamila for her seminar.
Great, thank you, Frances, and thank you, Ali. So I hope that works to be sharing the screen. Great. Oh, it's started on its own accord. Okay. It seems to be having some technical difficulties. Let me try once more. Okay, Ali, can I just check in with you? Is that working?
We can see the introduction slide, yeah.
Yeah, great. And it's not racing forwards as it was before. Great, thank you. Yeah, so thank you very much, Frances, for the introduction. And I'm really excited to meet all of you, even if it's a bit virtual at the moment, rather than being in Lancaster personally. So I look forward to joining you there at some point once the restrictions are a bit lighter. And again, bear with me for a second while. Okay, there we go, back again. Great, so I wanted to talk today about development and resilience, rethinking intervention in biocultural landscapes. And I'm sure, as many of you know and probably work with, resilience has become an ever increasingly popular term in development discourse and practice. I've spent the past 8 years at the Resilience Centre, the Stockholm Resilience Centre, part of Stockholm University, first doing my PhD and then doing a postdoc, which was funded by SIDA, the Swedish International Development Agency. And as Frances mentioned, now starting a new project which involves digging deeper into some of the agency and critical institutional aspects of some of the work that I'll go into today, related to sustainability transformations. So today I'll give an overview of social-ecological resilience in relation to development, drawing on some of my previous work, including poverty traps and also some new conceptual work on coevolution. And I'll start by framing the issue by bringing you to a place. And this is a place that I've worked for about a decade now. And that was from the Tajik side, looking over to Afghanistan in the Pamir Mountains. And this is a place where over millennia, people have created life-giving soil by removing rocks from the land and irrigating it, and giving rise to incredible agricultural biodiversity. And not just is this incredible biodiversity, but also cultural diversity, which has co-evolved in what we like to call biocultural landscapes. This is also one of the poorest areas of the world, with some of the worst human development indicators ever recorded on the Tajik side, on the Afghan side, which also means that there's a lot of focus on development interventions in these areas. And I actually started my journey in the Pamirs as a development practitioner, and that's where a lot of my own questions come from, and that's what I explored in my PhD and in the subsequent postdocs. So the question that I focus on in the presentation today is, how can development processes for alleviating poverty better account for co-evolving relationships between people and nature? And so to frame it quite broadly, resilience and development has, as I mentioned, it's becoming increasingly popular in the development sector, and there's a lot of emphasis on building resilience. This is true, this can be seen through Oxfam reports, USAID, the World Bank, just to give a few examples. When we talk about resilience from a social-ecological perspective, we don't focus so much on resilience as an outcome, but more as a focus on capacities, which we argue can help make sense of development interventions. So the way that I talk about resilience and how we tend to use it at the Resilience Center is resilience as the capacity to persist, adapt, or transform in the face of change in social-ecological systems, and particularly unexpected change in ways that continue to support human well-being. And I should also say here that there are many different strands of resilience thinking. Social-ecological resilience thinking comes more from the ecological field, but that also in the past decade, there's been a lot of scholars from humanities and also social sciences, which have kind of come in and modified the theory and the thinking to some degree. So I count myself as one of those. Potentially we call ourselves undisciplinarians, and I'd be happy to engage and indeed will engage a lot more with Francis and hopefully a lot of you in those conversations over the next years. So to give a broad overview, which again I'm sure many of you are very aware of and work with yourselves. When we talk about social-ecological systems, we talk about the economy as embedded in society, as embedded and dependent on the biosphere. And this has been a perspective that's also been used as a way to describe how the SDGs, for example, are related to each other. And we also talk about that all social-ecological systems that everything is actually a social-ecological system in this era of the Anthropocene. So I'm presenting now some general assumptions that are made more generally within social-ecological system resilience. So one of the issues that I have with the term social-ecological systems is that it separates humans and nature, as we see also in that figure to the right there. So one of the things that some people have been working on, and I've also been trying to incorporate into my own work, is using a more process relational perspective and thinking of social ecological systems as intertwined. So we know they're whole to begin with. Why are we separating them into social and ecological dynamics and variables in order to measure them and bring them together again? So that's a theme I'll come back to throughout the talk. And then bringing in resilience. So resilience, quite simply, is the capacity to live with change in the face of uncertainty and surprise. And some of the core facets are anticipating, innovating, and learning. And resilience is about dealing with quick and slow change at the same time. So how do we maintain certain elements and shift others? And this is the figure of the iceberg is something that we came up in communicating resilience during the CETA project. And it's often only the tip of the iceberg that's considered when people refer to resilience. So reacting to symptoms or isolated parts of the system and looking at what are rapid responses to recover and to persist, rather than looking at what's underneath the surface, at the functions, pattern, processes, systemic structures, root causes, or mental models and paradigms that need to change. And those are often some of the slower level processes. Another way, and a more concrete way, I think, to think about this, as I introduced before, is resilience as the capacity to persist, adapt, or transform. So persistence being the capacity to resist change, and this could be good or it could be bad in the case of a poverty trap, for example, which I'll talk about in the next slide. So you may need to reduce resilience. So resilience is not always good. And adaptability to continue to innovate and change on the same pathway that you're on, or transformability, which means a fundamental shift to new pathways. And those are terms that I'll come back throughout the presentation. So coming back to this place, so a lot of my research, I feel, is either quite in-depth place-based and then also at times zooming back out to more conceptual work. So if looking at the development framing in the Palm years as one of the poorest parts of post-Soviet Soviet countries, or on the Afghan side, some of the worst human development indicators ever recorded, a common concept that's used is a poverty trap, which is the persistence of poverty under a given asset threshold. And it's based on a 1950s solo growth model. This model often still informs interventions, even though we know poverty is multidimensional, and there have been a number of Nobel Prizes won around that, but still often when we look at indicators of how we measure development success, it's still focused on the economic variables. And these type of interventions in turn affect landscapes and places, of course. And in this case, I'm interested in how it affects biocultural diversity specifically. So one of the first pieces of work that I wanted to present today was rethinking poverty traps with and how social-ecological resilience thinking can help us do that. So we conducted a review of the poverty traps literature and expanded this from a social-ecological perspective. So we did a broad overview of a lot of the different literature on different types of traps, poverty traps, lock-ins, social-ecological traps, and path dependence, for example, and then also looked specifically at 30 case studies. So this is a paper in World Development, and the main thing I wanted to mention here, since it was also the foundation of some of the next work that I'll mention, is that we looked at the kind of core key principles of poverty traps, which were persistent, undesirable, and reinforcing, but that poverty traps conceptualizations were often missing the external factors or drivers that were reinforcing the trap. They were often missing the path dependencies or legacy effects, often missing cross-scale interactions between local and global scales, and also often missing social-ecological diversity as a key factor of creating traps. So this kind of laid the foundation for some of the for another poverty trap model, which I'm going to introduce now. And I wanted to bring this in again as an example of how we've used social-ecological resilience thinking to rethink some prominent development concepts. And this is similar to the figure that I showed in one of the first slides about how economy is embedded in society, is embedded in the biosphere. And what we did was I teamed up with Stephen Lade, who's a theoretical physicist, which is not my usual domain of work, but it was a really fun collaboration. And what we did was look at different assumptions of poverty traps across different contexts and make like different theoretical models to test this. And what one of these looks like is like this. So most poverty trap models
as I mentioned before, failed to consider any dimensions other than physical capital or financial capital. And so what we did was we added 2 more dimensions, natural capital and cultural capital. That's still a really simplified view of the world, obviously, but it's an improvement to just looking at monetary capital. And so this graph here, this figure here, shows a 2-dimensional graph, since the 3-dimensional one is quite complicated. So this one's including just the natural, not the cultural capital. And then the blue square shows the diverse poverty environment relationships or assumptions that often underpin these models. And so based on the literature review that I mentioned previously, a lot of the poverty trap models assume that poor people degrade the environment because they have no other choice. But so we also, of course, looked at other evidence where poor do not degrade, such as in many biocultural landscapes, but rather that intensified agriculture has degrading impacts. So that's the assumption for this particular model. We tested all of them, and you could find those in a paper in Science Advances. And then we treated these with the yellow box with different poverty alleviation pathways. So pushing over the barrier, as we called it, or changing behavior or transformation. So in this particular model, we looked at what would a conventional asset input, such as an improved seed variety, look like. And so this was what we called a type 1 intervention. And the initial state is here, this purple bubble called poor, which was a poor monetary state, but with high natural capital. In this case, we were looking at agricultural biodiversity. And after the intervention, there was an intermediate state of better well-being in terms of monetary capital. But as we see, there was already a reduction in natural capital. And this was a very unstable state in the state space model that the theoretical physicist had that we'd modeled. And after any type of shock treatment, such as a drought, it quickly moved into a poor and degraded state that was worse off from before. So I just wanted to show this as what I thought was quite an interesting thought exercise, which is usually not the way that I work, but I thought it was quite powerful because we were using economic equations and then using my case-based knowledge and also drawing on quite an extensive secondary literature to test different assumptions. And I think this is one way in which some principles from resilience thinking can help us think differently about development interventions. And so I now want to shift to for the final part of the presentation to some of the conceptual work that I'm working on now and will continue to work on also in collaboration with Francis at LEC. And this is about fundamentally redefining resilience and development from a coevolutionary perspective. So the idea is to use coevolution to bring together social-ecological system resilience and development. And I'll present again, a case study and then go to some more conceptual work. So looking at these pictures, one is a red wheat variety called Rashtak from the Pamirs, and a boy presenting at New Year's a little animal called Nasrak, which they use as offerings to the gods. And then there's a traditional galber, which is used to winnow wheat, which I then bring into the conceptual work. And so what we did in this more empirical paper was to use a coevolutionary framing. This is proposed by Norgaard, 1993, in his book Development Betrayed, and where he proposes values, knowledge, environment, technologies, and organization co-evolve to create different development outcomes. And so what I did was, using quite ethnographic methods, observe sowing, harvesting, and celebration around this particular red wheat variety. And I followed a specific intervention of a new wheat variety into a specific in a particular valley. And village A maintained the traditional red wheat variety Rashtak, whereas village B lost it. And this brings me back also to the process relational work, trying to break down some of the social ecological dichotomies that I find problematic. And rather than lost. Hi, everyone. I've lost my mouse. Okay, we're back. And rather than code the different nodes, so environment, knowledge, values, etc., I focused on coding the relationships in the qualitative analysis. And the nodes become just ephemeral moments in time in a constantly unfolding process. So this was an interesting empirical work. And what we found in village B, where the seed no longer exists, the traditional variety, so the environment and technologies, that part of the coevolutionary process has been stopped or changed, but the same knowledge, organization, and values around the type of collective work, the rituals, and the values around reciprocity, for example, continue to exist in part through the practice of ritual. And this is a picture of a teacher, Molim Sakori, who every year does the harvest dance to teach children about the harvesting of this variety. So I think this brings in interesting implications for practice, how focusing on daily practice and ritual as an entry point can make a valuable contribution towards more holistic and locally adapted development pathways. And yes, so then this brings me to the final and most new work. So I'm also very happy to get any comments or questions on this, and it's all kind of still emerging. But I wanted to kind of tie up the presentation with this because my intention with this presentation was to give a bit of a flavor or idea of how I'm trying to bring together social-ecological resilience and what I think it can bring to rethinking development processes. So again, as I started the presentation, it's an increasingly popular term, and we've seen, or what I've tried to show is how it can better integrate multiple dynamics in development and also deal with complexity and uncertainty. But what resilience means in a development context remains under-theorized, poorly understood or enacted, and much critiqued. So coevolution can possibly bring these two areas together, the social-ecological systems and resilience in development. And so I'll go through 3 propositions of how I think coevolution can help to do this, drawing on some of the cases that I've presented earlier. So in panel A, so the proposition 1 is that social-ecological relationships have co-evolved through processes of variation, selection, and retention, and are manifest in daily practices. So these are processes that are quite common in evolutionary processes. And in panel A, what I've tried to show is that in the red, that's how one often thinks about the ecological and the social as 2 separate processes. And then the ecological and the social with a link in the red is the way that a lot of social ecological research or human environment research addresses the social ecological by focusing on the linkages or the interactions and calling them this as well, like ecosystem services, for example. But what I think we could push further is thinking about these as intrinsically intertwined. So what that would mean would be that rather than talking about the coevolution of the ecological and the social, we're actually talking about the coevolution of intertwined processes. And therefore, we need new language also to be able to talk about what these intertwined entities look like. And rather than thinking of something new, of course, we have a lot of old concepts that can be helpful. And one of these is practice. So just looking at daily practice as a lens there. And I won't go into too much detail right now, but happy to come back to the slide in questions. So I've been thinking through this idea of variation, selection, and retention through agricultural biodiversity. So how certain varieties are selected and then retained, and the conscious and unconscious processes of farmers in making those selections. And the proposition 2 brings it then to a more meta or more meso level of resilience as the capacity to filter these coevolutionary processes, so to influence what is selected and retained. And this is this picture metaphorically of a galbert, this winnowing tool to winnow wheat. And it's different social or ecological processes. Some are more endogenous, some are more exogenous, some are more active or more conscious, and some are more passive or unconscious. And there's these sets of processes that influence which practices are retained in the face of an intervention. So the sieve here is representing an intervention. And what I hope that this can help do is to break open this black box of what resilience as capacity to persist, adapt, or transform means. So each of these pathways could represent, for example, a pathway of persistence, adaptation, or transformation. And it's each step of the daily practice that we experience in our daily lives in which people are making decisions in interaction with their environment that is defining what these pathways and what these trajectories look like. And so finally, that's quite a conceptual piece about thinking about what these development pathways look like. And so what Frances and I have started to do and hope to continue to do over the coming years is to incorporate a critical institutional lens with resilience for development pathways. So how are these capacities defined? Digging deeper into proposition 2, looking specifically at agency and also bricolage and transformation. And I think also exploring some of these productive tensions. So evolutionary change and path dependency, for example, or social-ecological relationality with structure and power, or novelty and emergence with structuration. So those are just a couple of the what we'll call productive tensions that Frances and I have come up with in some of our discussions so far, and I look forward to exploring more of those with some of you over the coming years. So that's the presentation for now. Thank you. And let's see if I can close this with less technical difficulties.
Great, thanks so much, Jamila. That was really fulsome presentation. There's quite a really lot of content there and really clear. So thanks very much. So this is the point at which people are free to write questions. And if you've got a question, can you type it into the chat bar, and then Jamila can deal with them as they come up. While people are just thinking about that, I've got a question just to get started, and it's probably a kind of, shows my ignorance of resilience thinking really in theory, but just a clarification of who or what, who possesses this characteristic of resilience. Is it a characteristic of individuals or of collectivities or of institutions or systems?
Yeah, thanks, Frances. That's a good question, and I think it could be all of those. And I think within the psychological literature, resilience is often thought of as resilience of the individual. Within the social-ecological systems thread of resilience, we tend to think of them as the resilience as the property, either as the property of a system, or also again increasingly as a process. And when I say system, it's from a complex adaptive systems approach. And so again, within this idea of system, increasingly thinking about some of the relational constituencies of what that system is. And I think there's also been often this idea of the rule of threes. So thinking about your focal system and then a system below and a system above. So if, for example, you're looking at the resilience of a community, you should also consider that of the individuals in a community or of the regional or national governance systems above it.
Great, thanks very much. Thank you.
Thanks.
Any questions, anybody? Okay, I've got another one. While people are still thinking, oh, here's a question, actually. There's one from Ben. Can you see that?
Yes.
Jamila?
Yeah. The question is, can you address your coevolutionary approach? Is this possible without falling into the trap of naturalizing what are clearly social political systems? Let me try to process the question for a moment. Yeah, so I hope I can answer this. Yeah, so thanks for the clarification as well, evolution being somewhat problematic. And I think this is a kind of a hotspot of conversation, a new term I like to use for thinking about productive tensions. So I've recently joined a coevolutionary group at the KLI, the Konrad Lorenz Center in Vienna, where it's a lot of people either coming from the very biological evolution side or from the more social evolution side. And I think, and there's of course a long history of critique against evolution. So I think for me, I like the idea of epistemological agility, and that as a researcher, we can also pick and choose concepts that we think are useful and disregard some of the aspects of it that aren't, but without hopefully falling into the ontological or epistemological fallacies that might be inherent in that. So one of the things, I guess, to try to answer the question about without falling into the trap of naturalizing what are clearly social political systems, the concepts of selection, variation and retention that I mentioned before, I've found really helpful in thinking through some of these more relational aspects between social and ecological systems, so that there is a lot of non-conscious or unconscious agency that is involved in how people are making decisions, and that, for example, we can therefore give the crops or the landscape some of that agency. And then in some of the conversations with Frances, she's brought up some critical perspectives of, okay, well, she would, rather than talk about variation, she would talk about pluralism, for example, in governance systems. So I don't have a very clear answer on that, more that it's something that I'm weary of and aware of. But I don't think any terms are ever neutral, but I'm hoping, or I've found that variation, selection, and retention have been helpful for me to think about these more relational aspects of combining human and non-human agency. But would be happy to continue that conversation. Great. And then a question from...
Can I just chip in,
yeah.
Jamila?
Yeah,
the two following questions are about practices. So yeah, one from Gordon and one from Luke. So you might want to just consider them together.
Thanks.
Or you might not.
Thank you. So I'll just, I guess people can see them. Gordon's asking about a particular approach to theory or practice that I'm working with, and Luke also asking about why they're particularly useful in the context of resilience. Right. So in response to a particular theory, practice theory is one theoretical input to how I think about practice, and the other one being, and that's more in like the action-oriented idea of practice theory, which I think is particularly relevant for development practice. And the second one being daily practice. Actually, also in the way that some social evolutionary theorists have thought about coevolution in the constantly evolving decisions of how we live in our daily lives. And then I've particularly linked it very strongly to more of a participatory observation methodology and using food specifically also as an object to break down and neutralize, not neutralize, but to break down some of the inherent power dynamics that exist in places like Afghanistan. And food, we found, has been a way also to uncover then some of the deeply colonized ideas, and often asking women, what do you think about the future? They'll say, oh, I don't have a perspective, or I don't know what's right. But then they'll give this wealth of knowledge about their history and landscape in relation to food. So that's kind of been my empirical entry point to practice. And then, and Luke, in response to your question about in the context of resilience, I think this is going more into the process relational work, and actually maybe this is also in part response to Gordon as well, drawing on some of the work by Karen Berard, for example, on the idea of how does she call it, like the cyborg, or as a deeply, I think it's called like deep empiricism, basically, that we can only ever know what we experience in place, and the idea that many of this, that a lot of this is embodied, and not at the conscious level. So, and that for me is related to social, maybe not resilience specifically, but social ecological aspect of resilience, because I think that many social ecological concepts thus far have divided these relational realms of the social and the ecological. And so practice and some of the theories around practice help us bring a relational perspective together. I hope that feels a bit like a one-sided conversation to be responding to the chat, but Frances, if you want to jump in, please do.
I think you're just throwing a lot out there for people to go away and think about, and also the really nice thing, maybe to, this is a start of conversations you can have with colleagues at LEC, so I wouldn't worry about that. I'm full of admiration for the way you're handling it. There's the next couple of questions are from, Elisabetta, plant scientist, and Ali.
Yeah, great, thanks. So how does climate change fit in the research? Within the broader realm of social ecological resilience, I think climate change is one of the many global dynamics, that uncertain dynamics. But I'll focus more specifically in my research, and I work in mountain areas, also in the Alps now, not just the Pamirs. And I think what's so fascinating in these areas is that there are crops that have been that have evolved in these niches in really beautiful and incredible and unique ways over millennia. And I guess why I'm so passionate about conserving or preserving these and not having development interventions kind of tinker too much with this is that a lot of these crops have been saved in, for example, the Svalbard seed bank. But it's the crops or the agricultural biodiversity themselves that have been saved, and not the knowledge and traditions and rituals behind them. So again, I think that's why like this framing of coevolution is potentially quite powerful, because it's not just the functional diversity or the response diversity of the individual crops themselves to changes in climatic conditions, but the entire rich like knowledge and culture and ritual that has co-evolved and actually created that agricultural biodiversity in the first place. So I think climate change is really underlying a lot of that, because there's 150 wheat varieties in the Pamirs, for example, 151, and so farmers never sow just one wheat variety in a given year. They'll sow many of them, and there's certain rituals around that, and there's some interesting projects going on now in the Pamirs as well about how farmers over the past few decades have been changing and adapting to some of the so the increase in flash floods, for example. So I hope that kind of answers it. Again, I'm interested in like the holistic aspect behind the climate adaptation of different crop varieties. And Ali, a lot of discussion about food system resilience, and the social ecological are very linked. And I wondered whether this is an area you're interested in. Yeah, so I think and you were asking specifically also about food system resilience in Europe at the moment. And this links to the previous question that I was trying to respond to. I think it's fascinating which foods people are coming back to in this period of lockdown. Sourdoughs, and I think there's a lot of shortages of wheat and yeast. Yeast itself is fascinating because the commercial yeast and also commercial milk bacteria that's sold is actually incredibly low in its diversity, and there's really strict EU regulations about which bacterial yeast can be used or sold, and so I think it's really in a way hopeful to see some of this resurgence of diversity in some of those foods. And in the Pamirs, they often talk about crisis foods, so the foods that people come back to in times of crisis and hunger, whether it was the collapse of the Soviet Union or the subsequent civil war or years of drought. There are certain crisis foods that are not just nutritious, but they, like mulberries, for example, when they run out of flour, people mill mulberries and eat mulberry bread, and that's a very common crisis food, but they're also spiritually nourishing. So I like those types of links, and I think that's, again, where the social ecological perspective could be interesting. It's not just to sustain ourselves through nutrition, but also through other more spiritual or social means. Great, there's lots of questions.
I think that's mainly people saying thank you and can we continue the conversation. Oh no, from
Great.
Nigel there.
Yes. Okay, so interested in entanglement, but what about the bigger, meaner forces you don't tangle with? Are there other models, metaphors for the less symmetrical big things? Is there a place in your resilience thinking for those? Good question. And if I guess I'll take my angle on your question. And I think there's been a lot of critique within resilience for not dealing very adequately with power, for example, which I think is absolutely true. And I think that, again, more recent resilience work has tried to do that. There's a great paper by Wijnand Boonstra, 2016, in Ecology Society, that brings in some of the perspectives on power, for example. But I do think, and this is something also that Francis and I have discussed before, is that I think there are tensions in dealing with this more process relational work that I've been presenting, and giving agency also to non-human actors, and possibly doing away with the structures and the entrenched power dynamics that have actually created certain systems of working in the first place. So I don't think that it's that resilience can't tackle these things. It might just be that we haven't done it as much yet. But again, I think that there's actually a lot of scope and potential for it there. So I don't think it's inherently incapable of doing that. And then a second thing, because maybe that's more of what you were going at, there's a lot of really interesting work at the Resilience Center of actually working with quite big and powerful actors in the seafood industry, for example, and kind of trying to transform some of the thinking around value chains in the seafood industry. So I think they're not like ontologically incompatible, but I think we need to maybe tread a bit carefully. But I think there's a lot of opportunity there for that.
Great, thanks, Jamila. I guess, I don't know if Al is there, we're coming to the end of our time. So,
yes.
Yeah.
So that's reached the end of our allotted time for this seminar. That was really fascinating. As you saw from the questions, I'm an ecologist by background, so it's really interesting to hear about some of these discussions on a not plant-animal basis, but a plant-animal-human basis. So thank you very much, and thank you for dealing with all of those really interesting and varied questions as well. All that remains for me to do today is to thank Jamila again, and to thank Francis for chairing the session, and also to direct you to the information about our next session, which is on Wednesday the 27th of May. Though it's likely this will be a pre-recorded session instead of a live session through Teams, because our speaker, Dr. Andrew Groover, is on the other side of America. So a pre-record will be much more practical, and then it'll be shared on our YouTube channel on Wednesday the 27th. Thank you very much.